Decolonization is basically the process where the colonies gained their independence. Some of them were violent, some of them were peaceful. What the College Board wants you to know is that Europe dominated the global political order at the beginning of the 20th century, but both land-based and transoceanic empires gave way to new forms of trans-regional political organization by the century's end. Part B, some colonies negotiated their independence, and we're going to be talking about both India and the Gold Coast in regards to peaceful negotiations. One of the reasons why India all of a sudden started pushing for independence was because new ideas spread into the country. The spread was both because of trade and because of the military forces that served in both World War I and World War II. Things that they wanted were things like democracy, individual freedoms and human rights, and of course equality. Remember that the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, and at first they wanted to work with the British to make reforms, but then they decided that they wanted to become a little bit more radical as the wars ended. The Muslim League was founded in 1906. The British, of course, supported the foundation of the Muslim League as well. What they were doing was pinning the Hindus and the Muslims against each other so that there wasn't unity amongst the natives of India. That way, they could continue their control. The Muslim League was specifically fighting for the fact that there was a huge amount of Hindu dominance in any of the active politics for India. Muslims did not have access to education, they did not have access to taking the exam that the British had set up. There was a lot of issues for Muslims within India. During World War I, India was suffering from a lack of basics. The total war did impact the colonies on a large scale because what the European powers were doing was using the food and the supplies and the people and everything from the colonies to provide for their military. So that was part of an issue. Of course, the lack of basics is going to be blamed on the British, and that's actually partially correct. So there were some violent protests during World War I and in the post-World War I era. And of course, we have the global depression happening in the 30s, which did not improve things for India at all. Gandhi became a leader for the people in regards to wanting independence and in regards to getting the British out of India. However, he practiced nonviolence. He felt that there was a way to get the British out without violent protests and without violent rebellion. And he promoted these things through things like hunger strikes, getting back to the basics of Indian culture. He encouraged the Indians throughout the country to boycott British goods and do a couple other things that I'm going to talk about later in the lecture. What Gandhi's leadership did was he turned the INC into an effective group. At first, the INC was just elite Hindus who were willing to work with the British. Once Gandhi became a leader in the INC, he turned it into a protest group to try to get the British out. Under Gandhi's leadership, the INC did a couple things to promote their nonviolent protests against British power. One of them was the non-cooperation movement, which was lasted from 1920 to 1922. In the non-cooperation movement, he encouraged, and the INC encouraged, all Indians to boycott British goods. That means that they were not purchasing any textiles or anything that was being imported from the British Empire. And the goal was to go back to homespun Indian cloth. If you remember, we've talked about how Indian cloth was actually a lot better quality, but more expensive, and India did not really mechanize their textile making. So what Gandhi was doing was promoting Indian culture and Indian beliefs, and getting back to the basics of what it is to be Indian. And through this movement, he's going to affect the British economy on a very large scale. In the 1930s, he organized what was called the Civil Disobedience Movement, where they were going to boycott institutions operated by the British. Now, this was a little bit controversial because all of the medical services and education services were operated by the British. And so what he's encouraging people to do is basically go backwards in regards to medicine, which is not necessarily a good thing. And also boycotting the British schools as well. Again, promoting Indian ideals and culture. Violence did break out as a result of these movements, but they were always renounced by Gandhi. Gandhi did not promote the violent rebellions, and the British would arrest people quite often. Gandhi got arrested on several occasions due to his hunger strikes, and eventually the British would let him go. Part of the reason for that is because he became this martyr, this icon for the movement, and they did not want him to become a martyr if he were to die. Eventually the British had to give in to what the Indians were asking for, and what we get is called the India Act. What the India Act did was it created legislative bodies in each provinces, and they were not associated with the British in any way. So it was like local councils for each of the different provinces or states in India. There was a two-house national legislature with an executive office who was under control of the British, but the executive officer did not have to be British any longer. The Indians loved this plan and accepted it in 1937. What the British were basically doing was letting India go. They were setting it up for independence, and they organized a government for them. Unfortunately, the India Act does not work. There's so much tension between the Muslims and the Hindus that this government had no chance to succeed. We end up with a new leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who proposed the idea of a separate Muslim state. That state will become Pakistan. The official end of the British control, or the Raj, was in 1947. Gandhi formed a Congress Party, and the Congress Party was just like the Republican or Democratic Party. It was just a party led by Gandhi. And it created, unfortunately, the ending of the British allowed for more tension between the Hindus and the Muslims. And of course, Pakistan will be created because of the religious tension. And then Bangladesh will also be created, but the Bangladesh was split off of India because of a language issue. Since the creation of official independent India, they have maintained their democratic system. There's been a couple of rulers that you should probably know about. One of them is Indira Gandhi. She is not related to Gandhi. Some of the things that happened during her reign was the Green Revolution. We'll talk about the Green Revolution in detail later in the unit, but basically what she was doing was using genetically modified seeds and fertilizers and all kinds of new technology for agriculture to increase the food yields for the very, very overpopulated India. She also introduced massive birth control movements. However, her birth control movements were not readily accepted by the Indian people because it asked for the sterilization of men, not women. She lost the election in 1977, but does come back into office in 1980. The other issue that she had to deal with was the Sikhs. The Sikhs tend to live in the Punjab area in the north, and they want more autonomy. They want to be almost an independent state. Unfortunately, they became violent, and she attacked the Golden Temple in the Sikh region, which is a super important building. We actually looked at it previously. She was eventually assassinated by one of her Sikh bodyguards in 1984. Assassinations and violence in India is actually par for the course. There's many leaders and many politicians who lose their life as a result of the radical politics that is in India. Dhir's son, Rajiv, is going to take office in 1985, and he tries to negotiate with the Sikhs. He lost office in 1989, and while he was on campaign again in 1991, he was assassinated. Currently, India is an open democracy with a bunch of political parties, and that's part of the problem for the stability for India. Here is some data for the different political parties that exist in India. One of the largest parties is the INC, the Indian National Congress. They label themselves as social democrats. They're a lot like our Democratic Party. About 29% of the population are registered INC members. We have the Conservative Party, who is all about free market economics and very much like our Republican Party, is about 19% of the population. The Communist Party is actually split into two. You have a Marxist and a Marxist-Leninist party. Now, India is not fully industrialized, so it makes sense that there would be two forms of communism in India. About 8% of the Indian population is registered as a Communist Party member. The Nationalist Congress Party, which is a secular democracy who wants to take all religion out of politics, which for India, with Hinduism being so prevalent, is somewhat of a radical idea. Only about 2% of the population is part of this party. And there's hundreds of unrecognized political parties that are all throughout India. This is why people keep getting assassinated, because if you see, all the different political party means that the people who get elected don't get elected with a majority vote. They get elected with the most votes, but not majority. So it means that there's more unhappy people in India every time there's an election. Going down into Africa, we're going to talk about the British Gold Coast, or what eventually becomes Ghana. This area provided a lot of soldiers for both World War I and World War II. And one of the things about the impact of the Ethiopian invasion during World War II was that the Africans ended up becoming more nationalist as a result of that. They realized that the Europeans were not necessarily done with Africa, nor were they going to leave it alone. So it increases the nationalism throughout all of Africa. World War II shows that the British were weak, and what this does is gives the Africans motivation and inspiration to attempt to gain their independence. The other thing about the African decolonization is both the Atlantic Charter and the UN Charter made promises of independence for decolonization. Remember, one of the biggest attitudes in post-World War I and World War II was that colonization was bad and created serious problems for the world. The British were crazy in debt, and they did not want to give up the Gold Coast. And so there was quite a bit of work to get Ghana to be its independent country. Indian independence obviously is going to inspire the Africans even more. So what they did was they created a political party, much like the INC, called the United Gold Coast Convention. It was headed by a guy named Kwame Nkrumah. What they were doing was just asking for self-government. They wanted more representation for the natives in the legislative assemblies that the British had already set up for them. There were quite a bit of riots throughout the beginning of the movement. 29 were killed and 200 were injured in one specific riot. And Nkrumah decided to break away because he felt that the United Gold Coast Convention was too violent, and he was more like Gandhi. He wanted more non-violent movements towards independence. And so he creates a conservative political party called the UGCC. Eventually, Nkrumah founded his own party called the Convention People's Party, or the CCP. Their slogan was self-government now. The way that he tried to encourage self-government was through strikes and boycotts, and he was arrested by the British, where he served 3 years of his sentence. This actually made him more popular. The Africans started to look at him as a martyr for the cause and as this huge leader for the changes that needed to be happening within the Gold Coast. In 1951, they held elections, and more natives were included in the electoral process. And the CCP actually beats out the more conservative UGCC. Nkrumah was released from prison by the new British governor, partly because the people were calling for his release, and the British were losing control, so they just let him out. The British made a deal with Nkrumah. He was given the title Leader of Government Business. So basically, he was kind of given control of the area, but was still kind of under control of the British. The British still controlled the economy of Ghana. Now, this is going to make it very difficult for Ghana to be a successful state. By 1954, the Gold Coast had a new constitution with a fully elected internal self-government, so there was no British interest in their government. However, the British are still in charge of the economy of Ghana. The CCP does win, but not as easily as the last time, as more Africans are starting to gain political opinions at this point. In the north, the cocoa farmers doesn't like doing all the business with the British, and they created the National Liberation Movement to try to make the government more regional rather than the federal Gold Coast system that Nkrumah had established. Basically, they decided that the federation that Nkrumah had set up and the deal that he had made with the British was not good. And so in 1957, the Gold Coast officially became Ghana and fully independent from the British. Part of the reason why the British wanted to hold on to this territory is that there's a massive amount of gold, diamonds, and cocoa. And they already had a well-developed education system, and Nkrumah just actually improved upon that. The transportation system had already been built by the British. The British were very careful about their colonial holdings and spent a lot of time building railway systems. Nkrumah slowly became more socialist throughout his reign. So he didn't like that the state corporations were corrupt and they lacked trained workers. And another problem was that the resources started to become super scarce. And as a result, we have huge, large inflation, which will lead to more unemployment. What Nkrumah does do is improve public services, education, and healthcare. What most people thought throughout the 70s and 80s was that the key to economic success in the global world was industrialization. Nkrumah and Ghana was no different. They decided that they were going to invest on new industrial projects, but agricultural investments go down. This is going to be a problem because you have to be able to feed your people. Now, Nkrumah was capable of keeping out of the Cold War, which will improve its overall economy in general. Nkrumah started to spend a lot of time and money on African unity. There were pan-African movements throughout the late 70s and into the 80s. The idea of creating an African state, that all of the states would unite into a federation system. Ghanaians became upset with his involvement in the Pan-African movements, and he becomes super aggressive against them. So he outlaws all the political parties, arrested anybody who was not a member of the CCP, and he wasn't holding open elections. Nkrumah goes to Beijing in 1966 for a visit with Mao Zedong. What he was doing there was looking at more of their communist socialist programs and seeing what he could incorporate into his state. While he was out of the country, the National Liberation Council performed a coup and overthrew Nkrumah, and he was taken out of office. Today, Ghana is a unitary presidential constitutional republic, which means that they have free elections, and they are, because of their riches, they're actually doing okay. India and Ghana are examples of non-violent independence movements. However, there were a couple states that had to go through quite a bit of violence in order to gain its independence. Algeria and Vietnam was trying to gain their independence from France, and Angola was trying to gain independence. The Algerians fought for independence from 1954 to 1962. Both Muslim and European Algerians fought in World War I, and as a result of that, the idea of self-determination came into Algeria, and we end up getting Algerian nationalism. Eventually, the nationalist groups formed into what was called the National Liberation Army, or the FLN. The French government felt that Algeria was a state of France, just like Florida is a state of the United States. They did not consider it a colony at all, and in fact there's 1 million French Europeans living in Algeria in 1954. The FLN started attacking military and civilian targets on November 1st, 1954. In today's world, we would actually consider the FLN a terrorist group because of the attacks on the civilians that they were doing. The FLN was a super small group, and there were a lot of nationalist groups who condemned their violence and said that, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. Fighting in France broke out between veteran nationalist groups and the FLN, so there was actually fighting within France and Europe beyond what was going on in Algeria. This is called the Café Wars, and the Café Wars, about 5,000 people died in France over the issue of Algeria. The FLN started to gain support by founding labor groups, women's rights groups, and student groups. So what they were doing was they were appealing to the disenfranchised. They were appealing to the people who did not have a voice in any government. And the Muslim countries throughout the world were also supporting the FLN in regards to their independence from a Catholic France. Violence continued to increase, and the French living in Algeria requested the French government to step in and try to put down the violence of the FLN. Instead of using counter-violence, the French government actually tried to improve the economic conditions for the Muslim population. They felt that if they improved the economic conditions for the Muslims, then they would leave the FLN and no longer support it. In 1955, the FLN moved into urban areas rather than their focus on rural lands. Previously, focusing on the rural lands was not hitting a huge amount of people, but when you go into the urban areas, you're going to have a larger impact. They also started focusing more and more on civilian targets, so they're getting more and more aggressive as the late 1950s goes on. The French government reacted with a lot of violence, and the French say that they killed a little over 1,000 FLN troops. The New York Times and FLN said that they killed 12,000 Muslims. We don't know. Obviously, the French would lower that number because they didn't want to look like aggressors. And obviously the FLN would increase that number to make the French look super aggressive and like horrible people. The New York Times, however, reporting the same number as the FLN, shows that there was a lot of American sympathy for the idea of independence of these colonies. The French military were given police powers as a result of this violence. And the French government started to restructure its rule of Algeria. And Algeria was split into 5 districts, and each district had their own legislative assembly. The FLN also starts to become more organized and more like a political party rather than a terrorist group. In October of 1954, the foreign leaders of the FLN were arrested and held in prison for the duration of the war. So if you were associated with the FLN and you were living in Paris, then you were going to be arrested. The Egyptian president Nasser was a supporter of the FLN, and he was not captured, and we'll discuss that connection a little bit later. But violence escalated as the FLN started using terrorist tactics in Algiers. Algiers is the capital. They put bombs in public parks, they actually blew up Air France's offices, and the workers started to stage strikes. So these are all very violent, somewhat terrorist actions to gain independence. By 1957, the FLN had about 40,000 troops. And they're very violent. They're using terror tactics and guerrilla war throughout 1957 and 1958. The FLN started to control actual regions of Algeria. They collected taxes and they provided food for the citizens. If you're providing food for the citizens, you're going to continue to increase your support. The French government started to train and arm local Muslims throughout Algeria in order to try to oppose the FLN. They had 180,000 volunteer Africans trying to fight against the FLN internally in Algeria. After the French government leads into China, the French people were afraid the government was weak, and they wanted to abandon Algeria as well. So the French people living in France started to ask the French government to stop spending time and money in Algeria. The French government had an internal problem where they had to shift from the 4th to the 5th Republic, which is their current government. De Gaulle was in charge. President de Gaulle created a committee to write a new constitution for the 5th Republic. As a result of that constitution, Algerian men and women were registered to vote, and they were able to participate in the approval of this new constitution. So the Algerian conflict actually led the French government to create a whole new constitution and their 5th Republic. The goal was to try to end support of the FLN. He didn't think it was going to work. He was very hesitant about this new constitution. From 1958 to 1959, the French military was starting to regain control of Algeria. As the French left Indochina, they're able to dedicate more of their French troops into Algeria. The French at home were really pushing for an independent Algeria. The UN and NATO were also leaning more towards independence for Algeria, and were kind of pushing the French government to let it go. In 1961, 75% of the French and Algerians voted for an independent Algeria. De Gaulle was already negotiating with the FLN. He knew that this was going to happen. He knew that Algeria was going to become independent. The Evian Accord developed a 3-year plan to allow the government of Algeria to become independent. The French people would still own their own property. The French people were not going to be kicked out of the country. And the French government was still allowed to have military bases in Algeria. 91% of the people throughout France and Algeria voted yes to the Evian Accord. In the summer of 1962, 1.4 million refugees left Algeria for France. Most of these people were white European. However, today, there is still a large amount of migrants into France from Algeria. Angola was one of the first European colonies in Africa established by the Portuguese in order to do the slave trade. Fighting for independence was split between 2 groups, a Marxist group and a conservative group. In 1961, the MPLA, Portugal actually sent in troops and put down the rebellion. In the second phase, in 1975, the MPLA and UNITA actually united against Portugal. And today, Angola is a military regime. It has been since 1975. So while it is independent, it's still under control of a military dictator. There are 3 leaders that you need to know and associate with modern nationalism. Gandhi, you know, from India. Ho Chi Minh is Vietnamese. And then, of course, Nkrumah, we've already talked about with Ghana. Another thing that the AP wants you to know is that emerging ideologies of anti-imperialism contribute to the dissolution of empires. Regional religious and ethnic movements challenge both colonial rule and inherited imperial boundaries. They want you to know who Muhammad Ali Jinnah is. They also want you to know about the Quebec separatist movement, and they also want you to know about the Biafra sectionalist movement. I want to make sure that we fully understand the split between India and Pakistan. So Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was a member of the INC and wanting to protect Muslims in an independent India. He eventually left the INC when it decided to follow Gandhi's nonviolent movement. He was a leader of the All-Muslim. He asked for Pakistan what was the Lahore Resolution in 1940. Two happened, so obviously it was created yet. The leaders of the INC were arrested and gaining strength throughout India. Once India gained its independence, they were working to kind of some kind of compromise. It's not going to work. So it was created in 1998. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was first governor of Pakistan, but he only for a year. His reign were millions of refugees who the modern map of what we have been calling India. Pakistan is in the green, obviously. If you look to the north, this area. That area is super rich in minerals and resources, and so it's also mixed when it comes to so that another Punjab. If you and areas in the north are really important mineral-wise and economically-wise, and they ended up in India. So Pakistan kind of got crappy land as a result of the split. And so there's still tensions between Pakistan and India in regards to these areas. If you look to the east or the right, you can see Bangladesh. Bangladesh was created as a result of a language issue. It was actually called East Pakistan until 1971. The majority of the population in Bangladesh is Muslim, but they speak a unique language called Urdu. So they do not speak Hindi and they do not speak Arabic. So it's a totally different language, and that's why they were split off. But you can see Bangladesh is in between India's holdings, and so that area is not necessarily a very peaceful area either. The orange area on this map is Quebec. You can see that it shares a border with the United States, but the majority of the people who live in this area are French speakers. The rest of Canada actually speaks English. Part of that is because of the War of 1812. The French are going to lose this territory as a result of the French and Indian War, and then later they lost more during the War of 1812. And so as a result, we have a territory that speaks a completely different language than the rest of the state. In 1955, the province held a vote for independence Quebec, and they wanted to use the French language. 60% of the citizens in Quebec said that they wanted to stay a part of Canada. So instead, the Canadian government issued the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which protected the use of the French language and the culture in all of Canada. So if you ever go to Canada and you go into the eastern border, you actually really need to learn how to speak French, because in Quebec, they don't have signs or anything in English at all. Remember that the French are super protective of their language, and this is not different for the Quebecians at all. If you go into the rest of Canada, then you're going to be fine with English, and you'll see the influence of French culture. But the Quebec territory has been really careful about making sure that there's a lack of English in the region. Despite the fact that they wanted independence, there just was not enough people who wanted an independent state. The Biafra sectionist movement was a movement in the southeast area of Nigeria. They wanted independence in 1967, and they actually start a war that lasts until 1970. The issue is that there's a group of people who are a large ethnic group in the region, and they have their own language and culture. They are not Muslim at all. They actually are still very African in their religious belief, and they declared their independence in 1967. 1 million civilians died in the war, mostly due to famine that resulted from the fighting. The region was reabsorbed into Nigeria in 1970, so the movement was very unsuccessful. One of the biggest issues associated with all of these independence movements is the the changes in boundaries. And there was huge, massive population resettlements as a result. We're going to talk about India, Pakistan. We're going to talk about Palestine a little bit. And then we're going to talk about the Middle East a little bit. When Pakistan was created in 1948, 14.5 million people had to move. In 1951, Pakistan reported that there were over 7 million displaced people, and India reported that there were over 7 million displaced people. Neither government was equipped to deal with this. The majority of Hindus who were moving out of Pakistan territory go into Delhi. The city population went from just under 1 million to 2 million within a couple years. They were housed in old military and historical buildings, including military barracks. The government eventually turned the camps into permanent buildings, but it was not a very easy process. The issue was finding work and education for all of these new people. A lot of the Hindus who moved into India were educated and were middle class, and they were expecting to be able to find jobs within India. The government established vocational training for those who qualified for it. They also increased the enrollment sizes in the universities and other schools, so they were just packing them into the already existing schools. The stipends were given to good students in the fields of art, science, and technology. So if you excelled in one of these three categories, then you were given money by the state to encourage further education within those three categories, which you can see the impact of that today. The rural resettlement in India was a little bit different. There's a huge amount of land were left vacant when the Muslims left, and many who resettled on the empty land basically became tenants to the state, and they wanted to fully own the land eventually. The government eventually reclaimed and rehabilitated the lands that were arable due to the Green Revolution. Resettlement in Pakistan did not go as well as it did in India. They also have to deal with a bunch of Afghan refugees in the 1990s as a result of the Taliban's rise to power, which is still not going very well at all either. One of the biggest issues to the resettlement was missing women. India reported that 33,000 Hindu and Sikh women were abducted during the movements, and Pakistan reported that 50,000 Muslim women were abducted. Both governments agreed to find as many of them as possible. By 1954, India had recovered 20,728 Muslim women and gotten them back to Pakistan. Pakistan had recovered 9,032 Hindu and Sikh women and had gotten them back to India. But there's still a huge amount of women who went missing during the resettlement process. We have to discuss the creation of Israel. In 1922 to 1939, the modern-day state of Israel had an increase in Jews in the Jewish population. The British were actually supporting the immigration of Jews into the region as a result of both the rise of Hitler and anti-Semitism throughout Europe. In August of 1929, there was an explosion at the Wailing Wall. As a result, the British go into the territory to try to see what to do about the violence. They felt that the Peel Report by the British in July of 1937 said that their only way to solve the violence in Israel was Palestine at this point, was to create two separate states. By 1939, as a result of all the violence associated with the Jews moving into the region, 500 Jews and 3,000 Arabs had died. More immigrants were going to come in as a result of Hitler as well. What ends up happening is called the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the post-World War II era, the UK didn't want to deal with Palestine anymore. Partition was no longer an option. People felt badly for the Holocaust, and so especially the Americans, and we were pushing for a Jewish homeland. There was an attack on the King David Hotel by Jewish extremists on July 22, 1946, and it killed 92 people. Most of these people were British government employees. The King David Hotel is where the British housed most of their employees who were there working as part of the mandate system. The British may have been warned, but didn't evacuate the building. People feel that the British used this instance as an excuse to get out of dealing with Israel-Palestine altogether. As a result of the King David Hotel issue, the British handed the mandate of Palestine over to the UN. The UN created a special committee on dealing with Palestine, and they suggested that partitioning Jerusalem under an international trusteeship. In other words, Jerusalem would not belong to either Palestine or Israel. The Arabs said no way. The General Assembly vote for partition didn't happen. There were 33 for partition and 13 against it. There was a huge amount of states that did not show up for the vote, and that was done on purpose because a lot of states did not want to take a side in this issue at all. As a result, the Arabs throughout all of the Middle East and North Africa created the Arab League in 1945. In 1948, the State of Israel was officially declared, and the Arab countries invaded. Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, they all declared war on Israel. Israel did really well in this war, and they actually expanded past their original borders. And the Arab states started to split on this issue altogether. This is obviously, as the Israelis start to expand, going to create a Palestinian diaspora. The UN is going to set up refugee camps for the Palestinians. 85% of Palestinians left their homes for these camps, which includes about 720,000 people. People kept declaring war on Israel, and as a result, Israel continued to gain land throughout several different wars. They also continued to build, which made resettlement of Muslim Palestinians even more difficult. The Palestinians lived in camps set up by the UN, but there were still water issues and a lack of permanent buildings. This is still an issue today for the Palestinians. There are still quite a few Palestinians living in these old UN refugee camps set up in the 1960s. Access to water is one of the most controversial issues for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 6 million people in Israel consume 3 times as much water as Jordan, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip altogether. Half of the water comes from areas outside of the Israeli state. The Jordan River and there's an aquifer under the West Bank provide most of the water. And what the Israeli state did was they created piping systems so that they were taking water from these areas and providing it to the Israeli people. 60% of Israel's water supply comes from disputed areas.